One hand, 31 dead, 4 hours of hell. May 12, 1945. A Japanese grenade explodes in Rifleman Lachhiman Gurung's hand, obliterating his right arm below the elbow. Blood pouring from his shredded body, fingers blown off, leg mangled, and he's staring at waves of Japanese infantry charging through the darkness. He grabs his rifle with his one remaining hand and fights alone for 4 hours. 31 enemies dead. He refused evacuation. He refused to retreat. One Gurkha with one hand held a trench because his brothers were counting on him. This is Lachhiman Gurung, the soldier who proved you don't need two hands when you refuse to quit. Subscribe for impossible courage. Let's begin. Lachhiman Gurung wasn't supposed to be a legend. He was supposed to be another poor kid from the Himalayan foothills of Nepal, doing what boys from his village did. Farming terraced fields, raising livestock, living and dying within 20 miles of where he was born. Born 1919 in a small village in western Nepal, one of those places where life hadn't changed much in centuries, where families survived on whatever they could grow on steep mountain slopes and nobody had excess of anything, where young men had exactly two options: stay and farm or join the military. And joining the military for Nepali men meant one thing: becoming a Gurkha. The Gurkhas are one of the most interesting military traditions in modern history. Nepali soldiers recruited by the British Indian Army starting in the early 1800s after the British fought a war against Nepal and were so impressed by the fighting qualities of Nepali soldiers that they decided if you can't beat them, hire them. The British discovered that men from the mountain regions of Nepal made exceptional soldiers, physically tough from growing up at altitude, culturally conditioned to view courage and martial skill as the highest virtues, loyal to their units and commanders in ways that exceeded normal military bonds, and absolutely fearless in combat to a degree that seemed almost suicidal to European observers who valued self-preservation over honor. The Gurkha regiments became elite units within the British Indian Army, deployed to every major conflict the British Empire fought from the 1800s through World War II, earning a reputation as some of the best light infantry in the world. The Gurkha recruiting system worked like this. British officers would travel to Nepal annually and conduct recruitment drives in mountain villages. Young men would travel sometimes for days to reach the recruitment centers, and only the fittest and most determined would be selected because standards were high and competition was fierce, since a Gurkha salary was significant money for families living in subsistence conditions. Being selected as a Gurkha wasn't just a job, it was a family honor. Villages would celebrate when one of their sons was chosen, and the expectation was that you would serve with distinction or die trying, because bringing shame to your family or your regiment was worse than death. This cultural context is critical to understanding what happened in Burma in 1945, because Lachhiman Gurung wasn't just a soldier following orders, he was a Gurkha carrying the honor of his family, his village, and his regiment, and that cultural weight made retreat or surrender psychologically impossible, even when physically he was destroyed. Lachhiman Gurung was selected for the 3rd Battalion's 2nd Gurkha Rifles in the late 1930s, went through training that was designed to be harder than combat because Gurkha doctrine believed that brutal training produced soldiers who wouldn't break under pressure. Learned to march long distances carrying heavy loads at altitude, learned close-quarter combat with the kukri, the curved Nepali knife that every Gurkha carries and that has its own mythology around never being drawn without drawing blood. Learned rifle marksmanship and small unit tactics, and most importantly, learned the Gurkha regimental culture where individual courage was expected and cowardice was unthinkable. By the time World War II began in 1939, Lachhiman Gurung was a trained rifleman in one of the British Indian Army's most elite regiments, ready for deployment to wherever the war took him. 1942 to 1945, the Burma Campaign, one of the most brutal and least remembered theaters of World War II, where British and Indian forces fought Japanese troops through some of the worst terrain and climate conditions imaginable. Dense jungle, monsoon rains, mountains, diseases like malaria and dysentery killing as many men as combat, supply lines stretched to breaking, and an enemy that fought with fanatical determination and rarely surrendered. The Japanese had invaded Burma in early 1942 as part of their broader offensive to secure Southeast Asia and cut off Allied supply routes to China. British and Indian forces had retreated back to the Indian border, and from 1942 to 1945, the Allies slowly pushed back through Burma in a grinding campaign where progress was measured in miles gained at horrific cost. The 3rd Battalion 2nd Gurkha Rifles deployed to Burma as part of the British 14th Army, the so-called Forgotten Army, because they were fighting in a theater that got less attention and fewer resources than Europe, but faced an enemy just as determined and conditions that were arguably worse. Lachhiman Gurung spent years fighting in Burma, patrolling through jungle where visibility was measured in yards, ambushing Japanese supply lines, defending positions against night attacks, enduring monsoons that turned everything to mud and made resupply nearly impossible, watching brothers die from disease and combat, and developing the kind of combat experience that turns ordinary soldiers into veterans who know instinctively how to stay alive.
By May 1945, the war in Burma was in its final phase. The Japanese were being pushed back toward Thailand. They'd lost most of their territorial gains. Their supply situation was desperate, but they were still fighting with the same determination they'd shown throughout the war, conducting counterattacks and defensive stands that inflicted heavy casualties, even though strategically they'd already lost. The 3rd Battalion 2nd Gurkha Rifles was part of operations to clear remaining Japanese forces from central Burma, conducting offensive patrols and establishing defensive positions in areas where Japanese units were still active. And on May 12, 1945, Lachhiman Gurung's section was occupying a defensive position near the village of Taunda, a small outpost that didn't matter strategically but mattered tactically because it controlled a route the Japanese were using for withdrawal. The position was a series of trenches and foxholes, maybe 20 Gurkhas total, rifles and a few light machine guns, positioned to interdict Japanese movement and hold against counterattacks until the main force could advance. Intelligence suggested Japanese forces in the area, but nobody knew exactly how many or when they might attack, so it was standard defensive posture, sentries on watch, everyone else trying to sleep, weapons cleaned and ready, waiting for something to happen, because in Burma, something always happened eventually. May 12th, 2100 hours, full darkness, the kind of jungle darkness where you can't see your hand in front of your face, and the Japanese attack begins. Not a probing attack, but a full assault. Screaming infantry charging out of the jungle toward the Gurkha positions, grenades flying, rifle fire, the chaos of night combat where everything happens by sound and muzzle flash, and you're shooting at movement because you can't distinguish targets. The Gurkhas open fire, machine guns traversing, rifles firing as fast as they can reload, grenades being thrown back, the kind of desperate close-quarter fighting where the line between your position and the enemy position is measured in yards, and everyone knows that if the position breaks, people die.
Lachhiman Gurung is in a forward trench with 2 other Gurkhas, one of the most exposed positions in the defensive line, and Japanese grenades start landing in and around his trench because the Japanese have identified it as a key position and they're concentrating their attack on breaking through there. The first grenade lands near the trench. Lachhiman grabs it and throws it back before it explodes. The second grenade lands, he throws it back. The third grenade lands, he grabs it, pulls his arm back to throw, and it detonates in his hand as he's releasing it. The explosion at point-blank range destroying everything below his right elbow, blowing off fingers on his left hand, shredding his right leg and face with shrapnel, and leaving him in a trench with what's left of his right arm pumping blood and pain beyond description, and the knowledge that if he passes out or retreats, the Japanese will overrun this position and kill everyone behind him. The two other Gurkhas in his trench are dead or incapacitated from the blast. He's alone. Japanese infantry are meters away in the darkness, and military doctrine says a soldier with injuries like this is combat ineffective, should call for medical evacuation, should at minimum fall back to a secondary position and let someone else hold this trench. Lachhiman Gurung's response to military doctrine is to prop himself against the trench wall with his mangled body, grab his rifle with his left hand, the one that still has enough fingers to work a trigger and operate the bolt, and start shooting Japanese soldiers who are charging toward his position, expecting to find either corpses or men too injured to fight. The Japanese are stunned because they threw grenades into this position, heard the explosion, assumed the defenders were dead or disabled, but now there's rifle fire coming from the trench, and their lead elements are getting shot and falling, and the attack that should have been a breakthrough is meeting resistance from a position that should be undefended. They can't see in the darkness that it's one man, they assume it's multiple defenders, so they pull back and reorganize for another assault, and in that brief pause, Lachhiman is dealing with the reality of his injuries. His right arm is gone and bleeding heavily, his leg is shredded, he's in shock, his body is screaming at him to lie down and die or at minimum call for help. But calling for help means other Gurkhas have to leave their positions to evacuate him, which weakens the entire defensive line, and besides, he's still capable of fighting, so why would he leave?
The second assault comes harder, more Japanese, closer coordination. They're trying to swamp the position through numbers, and Lachhiman keeps firing. One-handed bolt-action rifle operation, which is nearly impossible because you need one hand to hold the weapon and aim, and another hand to work the bolt to chamber the next round. But he's bracing the rifle against the trench wall and using his left hand to work the bolt and trigger simultaneously. Awkward and slow, but functional, and every shot counts because ammunition is limited and targets are close, and missing means they reach the trench. Japanese soldiers are getting within grenade range, throwing more grenades. Lachhiman is catching them and throwing them back with his one functional hand before they explode, a physically impossible task that he's accomplishing through reflexes and determination, and the fact that letting a grenade explode in your trench isn't an option. The third assault comes at midnight, the heaviest yet, and this time Japanese infantry reach his trench, close-quarter fighting with bayonets and kukri. Lachhiman dropping the rifle and pulling his kukri with his left hand, the curved blade that Gurkhas train with from childhood, and engaging in hand-to-hand combat while missing most of his right arm, using the trench walls and his kukri and pure aggression to kill Japanese soldiers who have both hands and full mobility but don't have the desperation of a man defending his brothers. The fighting is savage, bodies piling up in and around the trench, Lachhiman covered in blood, both his own and enemy, operating on adrenaline and willpower because the pain is beyond processing, and his body should have shut down from blood loss and shock, but hasn't because he won't let it. The assaults continue through the night, the Japanese trying every tactical approach they can think of, flanking attacks, direct assaults, suppressive fire followed by grenade rushes, and every time Lachhiman stops them, sometimes with rifle fire, sometimes with grenades thrown back, sometimes with his kukri and hand-to-hand fighting, and the Japanese can't understand why this one position won't fall. They know they've wounded or killed the defenders because they heard the explosions and saw their grenades land, but this trench keeps fighting, and their casualties are mounting, and dawn is approaching, which means daylight and allied reinforcements and air support.
By 0400 hours, the attacks are faltering. Japanese casualties are too high, they've lost momentum, their commanders realize they're not breaking through here and daylight is coming, and the assault stops. Survivors pulling back into the jungle, leaving their dead scattered across the killing ground in front of and around Lachhiman's trench. As dawn breaks, the Gurkha officers come forward to check positions, expecting to find casualties, and instead find Lachhiman Gurung still alive, still at his post, surrounded by dead Japanese soldiers. 31 bodies in and around his immediate position confirmed killed by him during the 4-hour battle. And his response when asked if he needs medical evacuation is that he'll stay at his position until relieved because the Japanese might come back.
The medics finally convince him to accept treatment, tourniqueting what's left of his right arm, treating the shrapnel wounds, addressing the blood loss, and transporting him back to a field hospital where doctors are baffled that he's alive, much less conscious, because the injuries alone should have killed him within minutes, and the blood loss should have caused unconsciousness long before 4 hours passed. But he's a Gurkha, and Gurkhas don't quit just because they're missing body parts. His commanding officers immediately write him up for the Victoria Cross, the highest military decoration in the British honors system, equivalent to the American Medal of Honor, and the citation reads that Rifleman Lachhiman Gurung, despite being severely wounded by a grenade that destroyed his right hand and caused multiple other injuries, refused medical evacuation and defended his position alone for over 4 hours against repeated Japanese attacks, personally killing at least 31 enemy soldiers through rifle fire and close combat, and maintaining his position until the enemy withdrew, demonstrating exceptional courage and devotion to duty in keeping with the highest traditions of the Gurkha regiments. The Victoria Cross makes Lachhiman famous, not just within the military, but in Nepal, where Gurkha soldiers are national heroes, and earning the Victoria Cross is the highest honor imaginable, proof that their warrior culture produces men capable of extraordinary feats. The British use him for morale and recruitment, having him appear at ceremonies and events. But Lachhiman isn't comfortable with fame. He's a village kid from Nepal who did what any Gurkha would do in his situation, which is fight until you win or die. And the idea that this deserves special recognition puzzles him, because from his cultural perspective, he was just doing his duty.
Post-war Lachhiman Gurung returns to Nepal, tries to readjust to civilian life with one hand, marries, has children, lives quietly in his village, doing what disabled veterans do, which is make the best of what remains and try to find purpose outside military service. The British government provides a pension for Victoria Cross recipients, enough money that his family is comfortable by Nepali village standards, and he becomes a respected elder in his community, someone young men come to for advice and stories, living proof that Gurkhas live up to their reputation. He attends Gurkha regimental reunions, meets with other Victoria Cross holders, participates in remembrance ceremonies, generally being honored by institutions that recognize what he accomplished, even if he doesn't think it was exceptional. 2010, Lachhiman Gurung dies at age 92 in his village in Nepal, having lived a full life despite losing his hand in 1945. And his obituaries all note the same thing, that he was one of the bravest soldiers ever to serve in the British military, that his 4-hour stand in Burma exemplified Gurkha courage, that 31 Japanese soldiers died trying to kill one wounded man and failed because that man refused to quit. His Victoria Cross is displayed in the Gurkha Museum in the UK. His story is taught to new Gurkha recruits as an example of regimental values in action, and military historians study the defense of Pongda as a case study in how individual courage can influence tactical outcomes beyond what seems possible. The question of how he did it is interesting, because the physical requirements alone seem impossible. Operating a bolt-action rifle one-handed under combat conditions requires strength and dexterity that shouldn't be achievable. Catching and throwing grenades with one hand before they explode requires reflexes and timing that border on superhuman. Fighting hand-to-hand with a kukri while missing your primary hand requires balance and technique that most two-handed fighters don't possess. And doing all of this while bleeding heavily from traumatic amputation and shrapnel wounds requires pain tolerance and mental control that defies normal human limits. Medical experts looking at his injuries say he should have lost consciousness from blood loss within 30 minutes. Combat instructors say one-handed rifle operation at the speed required is essentially impossible. And yet the evidence is undeniable. 31 dead Japanese soldiers, 4 hours of continuous combat, verified by multiple witnesses and official records.
The answer probably lies in the combination of factors. Gurkha training is specifically designed to push men past normal limits and condition them to keep fighting when their bodies say stop. The cultural expectation that retreat or surrender is shameful creates psychological pressure that overrides physical pain.
The adrenaline and stress of combat can suppress pain signals and enhance performance temporarily, and Lachhiman's specific personality and physical conditioning gave him reserves that most men don't have. But mostly it comes down to decision. At some point during that first grenade explosion, when his hand was destroyed and he was bleeding and in shock, Lachhiman Gurung made a conscious choice that he was going to stay in that trench and fight until the Japanese stopped coming or he died. And once that decision was made, everything else was just execution. The significance of the battle itself is minor from a strategic perspective. The action at Town Dod didn't change the course of the Burma campaign. The Japanese were already losing. This was a small defensive action that held a minor position for one night. But tactically it mattered, because if that position had fallen, the Japanese could have broken through the Gurkha line and threatened the entire battalion. And operationally it mattered because it was one of countless small actions where individual soldiers held positions that shouldn't have been holdable, and collectively those actions added up to Allied victory in Burma. Lachhiman's stand wasn't unique in the sense that lots of soldiers fought desperate defensive actions in Burma, but it was exceptional in its duration and confirmed kill count, and the fact that one man with catastrophic injuries held off repeated attacks that should have overwhelmed him. The legacy of Lachhiman Gurung within the Gurkha regiments is that he exemplifies everything the regiments value: courage under fire, refusal to abandon brothers, fighting effectiveness even when severely wounded, devotion to duty over self-preservation, and the idea that Gurkhas don't quit regardless of circumstances. New recruits are told his story during training, not to glorify violence, but to establish standards, to communicate that when you wear the Gurkha uniform, you're expected to live up to a tradition of extraordinary courage. And that tradition isn't abstract mythology, it's documented history of men like Lachhiman who did things that seem impossible. The story also reinforces Gurkha cultural identity, the idea that Nepali mountain people produce warriors who are different from other soldiers, tougher, more determined, more willing to sacrifice. And whether that's actually true or whether it's a self-fulfilling prophecy created by cultural expectations doesn't matter, because the results speak for themselves. The broader lesson of Lachhiman Gurung's story is about what humans are capable of when cultural conditioning, training, adrenaline, and personal determination align. Most people in his situation would die or retreat, and that would be entirely reasonable. Nobody expects a man with a traumatic amputation and massive blood loss to continue fighting for 4 hours. But Lachhiman didn't operate according to reasonable expectations. He operated according to Gurkha expectations, which are that you fight until you win or die, and there's no middle ground. This kind of extreme performance is rare even in military history. Most Victoria Cross recipients earn their medals for acts of courage that last minutes or hours under extraordinary circumstances. Lachhiman's action lasted 4 hours of continuous combat while catastrophically injured, making it one of the most sustained individual combat actions ever documented. The comparison to other one-handed or disabled fighters is instructive. There are stories throughout military history of soldiers fighting effectively despite losing limbs. Usually they're using their remaining limbs to fire weapons or direct troops or perform support functions. Very rarely are they engaging in sustained close-quarter combat against multiple attackers over hours. Lachhiman's uniqueness is the combination of severity of injury, duration of action, confirmed kill count, and the fact that he was alone without support for most of the engagement. Most defensive actions involve multiple defenders supporting each other. Lachhiman was effectively solo after the initial grenade blast killed or incapacitated his trenchmates. The psychological aspect is worth considering because pain and injury create powerful incentives to stop fighting. The body's natural response to trauma is to protect itself by reducing activity and conserving energy. Overriding that response requires mental discipline, and in Lachhiman's case, probably also required cultural conditioning that made the alternative psychologically unacceptable. Gurkha culture emphasizes honor and shame in ways that Western military culture doesn't always appreciate. Bringing shame to your regiment or your family by showing cowardice is considered worse than death. And that cultural weight creates motivation that persists even when physical capacity is failing. Lachhiman couldn't retreat without shaming himself, his family, his village, his regiment, so the only psychologically acceptable option was to stay and fight regardless of injury. And once that framework is established, the question isn't whether to keep fighting, but how to keep fighting with whatever capability remains.
The modern military lessons from Lachhiman's action are debated. Some argue it demonstrates the importance of unit cohesion and regimental culture in producing soldiers who won't quit. Others argue it's an example of cultural expectations that push men to take unreasonable risks and suffer unnecessary casualties, and both perspectives have merit. From a purely tactical perspective, Lachhiman's decision to stay in position rather than retreat probably saved lives because it prevented a breakthrough. From a humanitarian perspective, asking men to fight until they're destroyed is morally problematic, even if it's militarily effective. The British Indian Army and later the British Army maintained Gurkha regiments precisely because their culture produces soldiers who will do what Lachhiman did. But there's ongoing debate about whether recruiting soldiers from economically disadvantaged backgrounds and conditioning them to value honor over survival is ethical, even if it's effective. What's undeniable is that Lachhiman Gurung did something extraordinary. Losing your primary hand and continuing to operate weapon systems effectively is nearly impossible. Fighting hand-to-hand combat with one hand against multiple opponents requires skill that most two-handed fighters don't possess. Maintaining consciousness and combat effectiveness for 4 hours while bleeding from traumatic amputation defies medical expectations, and the combination of all these factors over sustained duration with confirmed results creates a combat action that's studied in military academies as an example of human performance at extremes. Whether other soldiers could or should try to replicate his actions is separate from acknowledging that he did it and documenting what happened, so military historians and psychologists and cultural anthropologists can study how extreme performance emerges from the interaction of individual capability, cultural conditioning, training, and circumstance. If you know someone who's facing an impossible situation where the reasonable choice is to quit, but something inside them says keep fighting, someone who's been told their injury or disability or circumstance means they're done, but they're not ready to accept that verdict, share this story. Not because everyone should be Lachhiman Gurung, but because sometimes we need reminders that human capability under pressure exceeds what seems possible on paper. That cultural expectations and personal determination can override physical limitations, at least temporarily, and that fights aren't over until you decide they're over, regardless of what your body or the situation is telling you. Subscribe to this channel for more stories of warriors who didn't just endure impossible circumstances, they dominated them. Battles where individual courage changed outcomes that seemed predetermined, and soldiers who proved that weapons are only as effective as the will of the person using them. Hit the notification bell because we're bringing you more stories of impossible achievement, more proof that human performance extends far beyond initial assumptions when someone decides that quitting isn't an option, and more examples of warriors who rewrote the rules of what's possible through sheer refusal to accept defeat.
And remember, when you face your own impossible situation, your own moment when staying means suffering and retreating means safety, you have the same choice Lachhiman Gurung had. You can protect yourself, or you can protect those counting on you. You can do what's reasonable, or you can do what's necessary. And the difference between ordinary and extraordinary is often just the decision that you're not done fighting until the fight is over. Lachhiman Gurung lost his hand to a grenade, bled for 4 hours, killed 31 enemies, and refused to quit because his brothers were counting on him, and Gurkhas don't abandon their brothers. That choice made him a legend. What will you choose when your impossible moment comes?